Soll die Kinder wie die Mame sein. Samachti samari mahuvim. Look around, it's Gan Eden. Kisamecha chol tziricho. Gan Eden miketem. Samachti samari mahuvim. Look around, it's Gan Eden. Kisamecha chol tziricho. Gan Eden miketem. Hands with the feet, punch with the head. Tut das Wasser geht. Hands with the feet, punch with the head. Tut das Wasser geht.
Good Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. We're so excited. Shabbos is almost here. We're going to do some beautiful learning on a Friday afternoon. What could be better? Let's light up the darkness. That was Eighth Day singing their song, Samach to Samach. Who is with us as we get together to do a little learning on a Friday afternoon? Paula in Chicago, Brandon in Knoxville, Nancy in North Carolina, John in Maine, Ezra in Montana, Randy in Florida, Margot in Ontario, Canada, George in Portland, hello, hello, Guy in Dayton, Gordo says hi. Sam in Plano, Texas. Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Ocala, Florida. Currently needing the challah for Shabbos. And Charles in Dallas, Texas. Welcome, everybody. I'm not going to do a teaching before we start, because we got to put our thinking caps on and make sure. I want to not speak too fast today, because this is tricky stuff, right? Where are we? We're on page 38. This tractate ends on page 40. So with God's help, we'll be making a siyum Sunday night. Be ready to make a l'chaim and make a bracha over, cracker or something. When we, God willing, finish this tractate, Beitzah, the 8th volume of the Talmud, on Sunday evening. We're in chapter 5, the final chapter. We're continuing our discussion of the second Mishna. So this is one of those things. It's not so easy, right? It's a real rabbinic kind of concept about the Shabbos boundary, and it's going to apply on the festival as well. So the simple idea, we started talking about it yesterday, is that for the sake of the restful nature of Shabbos, there's a limit how far you can walk on Shabbos. And because there's a limit of how far you can walk, that's why they didn't let you ride an animal either. But the limit on walking is 2,000 cubits in any direction from your dwelling. Right now, if you have an erev of courtyards, joining courtyards, that dwelling place can be large. LA counts almost as like a huge part of LA, a huge swath of LA counts as a single dwelling, and then the Shabbos boundary would be 2,000 cubits from the edge of this community erev. But if you just live, out there in the countryside somewhere where there's no, city erev, town erev, okay, so now you can go 2,000 cubits in any direction from where you establish your dwelling for Shabbos. Now, if you let's say my house is here out in the countryside, and I want to go have lunch with my buddy, and he lives 3,000 cubits away. So that's beyond my boundary. Can I go have lunch with him on Shabbos? Can I walk over to him on Shabbos day? Yes, because what I need to do is establish my Shabbos dwelling before Shabbos starts by locating an erev. Now, this is a different kind of an erev, right? An erev for the purpose of shifting my Shabbos boundary, how far I can walk in that direction. And so I place a basket of food. That's what constitutes the erev itself, what allows me to declare that this is going to be my dwelling. I stash a basket of food somewhere safe between my house and his. So in a sense, that's going to be my dwelling. Let's say it's halfway between us. He's 3,000 cubits away. So the first 1,500 cubits of this walk, I'm actually walking to my dwelling from the house where I happen to be standing in. It's my house, but I've adjusted it. I've made it so that for the purposes of the walk that I'm going to take on Shabbos, my dwelling is over there. Now, since my dwelling is now 1,500 cubits away from my house, that means that in the other direction, away from my friend's house, instead of having the 2,000 cubits that I could walk if I just left my dwelling be my Shabbos dwelling, now I can only go 500 cubits in that direction. But I can go 1,500 in this direction just to get to that basket of food, and then another 2,000 if I want, but another 1,500 will get me to my friend's house, and in that manner, I've shifted my Shabbos boundary. I haven't violated the prohibition against walking more than 2,000 cubits from my dwelling, and I can get to my friend's house who's 3,000 cubits away. So that's that general concept of Shabbos boundaries. Now in our Mishnah, we've been talking about what about objects that belong to people but are going to move independently of that person, because you're going to lend it to somebody, they're going to take it away, it's going to be used by somebody else. So an object that belongs to me and started Shabbos in my house, the basic principle is that it's going to have the same Shabbos boundaries as I do. And the way they word that is it has the same, how do they say it? Just the wording. These are as the feet, right? This object is as my feet, right? So an object that belongs to me and which is not muktzah, so that somebody can use it on Shabbos or on a festival. So let's say some food. It can only go, 2,000 cubits in any direction from my dwelling, just like I can, even if somebody else is going to take it away, right? So you can imagine maybe somebody else shifted their Shabbos dwelling closer to me. This is all so mathy, so geometry-like. But maybe I can get a little, I don't know where my eraser is, but here, right? So the idea is, let's say, whoop, right? And then let's say he's here, whoop. Okay, so let's say that this is my house, and this is where I didn't move my Shabbos dwelling. So this is my dwelling, and I can move 2,000 cubits on Shabbos. Let's say this is my friend's house, and he can move 2,000 cubits away on Shabbos. So we have an intersecting area where we could meet and get together. But let's say he wants to take some food, he wants to take something back to his house. So he might move his Shabbos dwelling by stashing some food before Shabbos over here, somewhere in between. And so now he's got a 2,000 cubit limit that it might be like this. The circles are getting ugly. I made a bad circle. But he's moved his dwelling so that he can get, from one place to the other. But that's his adjustment for his Shabbos boundary, that center circle. If I didn't change my dwelling, then I and the food in my house, and that's why it's going to be more, well, whatever. I and the food in my house have the same limit, my original circle, right? I'm trying to make it, I've made a mess of this, but my original circle. So he couldn't take food from my house, right? He himself could get from one house to the other, but he couldn't take food that started Shabbos in my house and I didn't move my dwelling all the way back to his house, because the food in my house is as my feet. Now that's going to change if for some reason the ownership of that food in my house changed before Shabbos, possibly even after Shabbos, as we're going to be discussing today, that it became his food and he did shift his dwelling, so then he would be able to get it all the way back to his house. These are the general concepts. Don't worry if it seems a little confusing now. It should get a little clearer as we proceed. Okay, we pick it up. We're on today's page is 38. but yesterday we didn't get to the end of page 37, so we're going to pick this up on the B side of 37, and actually not so far from the top. So the sages taught, in the case of two people who borrowed one robe in partnership, think of it as one tuxedo, right? So we only have one tuxedo between us. And we borrowed it. We neither one of us owns it, but we borrowed, like we both have a mutual friend who owns a tuxedo. We both want to use this tuxedo. So the two of us are going to borrow the single tuxedo from our third mutual friend. Now, this person, in order to go to the study hall with it in the morning, and that person, in order to enter a wedding feast in the evening, right? So we both want to use this fancy tuxedo. I want to use it to go to the study hall during one part of the festival or of Shabbos. My friend wants to use the tuxedo for a different time, at a different time of the same festival or the same Shabbos. All right? So that's our goal. And that's what we want to do. All right? And now each of us made a joining of Shabbat boundaries, this moving the Shabbos boundaries like I was talking about at the beginning. And I did it for myself to the north in order to reach my destination. And that one made an error for himself to the south in order to reach his destination. And the one who made an error for himself to the north. Okay, so let me erase it again. Okay. So we can get clear on this. This is just two circles. Okay. So we're in this situation, just two circles, and those dots represent the center of each circle. Now, the point is that I want to, the reason that I made my dwelling that I established my dwelling here, okay, is because I'm going to maybe pick up the suit somewhere in here, and I want to get to over there, which is the study hall where I want to wear the suit to. And my buddy, he wants to go to a wedding feast over here. Now, both of us are going to fail in our desire. We want to take this one suit. I want to wear it to the study hall over here during one part of Shabbos. He wants to wear it to the wedding during this other part of Shabbos. And we start in here. That's where we pick up the suit. Now, the problem is, since we both borrowed it with the intent to use it during this Shabbos, it belongs to both of us. And therefore, that suit is going to be as both our feet. That suit can only go to places where both of us can go. And what does that mean? That means that the suit can only be used in that area there. I'm not going to be able to get the suit to the study hall. He's not going to be able to wear the suit to the wedding. We didn't handle this situation correctly, and we're not going to be able to do what we intended to do. And similarly, the one who made, and now this, the Mishna is explaining what I just said, right? So the one who made an error for himself to the north may walk it with that robe only to the north as far as the feet of the guy who made his Erev to the south could go, and the one who wants to go to the south can only wear that robe as far as the feet of the one who made his Erev to the north could go. And if they made their respective limits in the center, okay, so now a little bit different, right? So let's say that again, forgive me for making such imperfect circles, but let's say, this is my limit, and that's my dwelling. That's where I established it. And this is his dwelling where he established it, and these are his limits. And these circles should be the same size, right? And I want to get to here, and he wants to get to there. And our idea was, okay, well, we're going to pick up the suit here. We can both go there, and then I could go there, and he could go here. But the rule is still the same as in the first case. The suit can only go where both of us can go since we both borrowed it together. What's the result? The suit can't move at all. Because if I take it anywhere in my circle, it's out of his circle. And likewise, if he takes it anywhere in his circle, it would be out of my circle. And so the result is the suit is trapped. Nobody can wear it to go anywhere except to wear it in that one little location at the intersection of both circles. Now we skip forward a bit. And what happens is, the part that we're skipping, the sages are not going to say, okay, that was in the case of clothing. What about if the thing that we wanted to carry to one place or the other was two different cases? One is an animal, right, where it's a living animal, and the idea is that we're going to slaughter it during the festival and eat it. But could we share it? Could it be slaughtered in one place and then the food go, my part of the food goes into my Shabbos boundary or festival boundaries, and his part of the animal that we slaughtered goes into his area. And the second case is with a barrel of produce, let's say a barrel of olives. And, again, we're going to obtain it. It's going to be sitting sort of between our boundaries or where the boundaries intersect. And I want to take a portion of the olives in my direction. He wants to take a portion of the olives in his direction. And what that's going to bring up is a principle that we've discussed a bunch of times, which is the principle of retroactive designation, right? Because at the time that the festival began, all the animal was whole, so all of its parts were in one place, and the barrel of olives was all in one place. We didn't designate that my portion of the olives that's going to go to my area versus his portion of the olives. Maybe we intended to divide, but we didn't actually say, these are the olives that's going to my area, these are the olives that's going to your area. And with the animal, we didn't say, we couldn't say, well, I'm going to take, this part of the animal, and you're going to take that part of the animal. Even if we said, I'm going to take the fore legs, and you're going to take the back legs, or I'm going to take, a steak from the belly, and you're going to take a steak from the shoulder. You still can't do that because the animal, ate as one. It was a whole, a unitary being, this animal with an animal soul. And so we're not going to go into the particulars of that discussion. What matters is that whether or not you're able to do that, to go halvesies on this barrel that hasn't been divided yet and then separate it out during the festival is going to depend on the question of whether we can use the principle of retroactive designation. And what we're going to say is, well, the part that we took during the festival, that was what I intended to take. Those are the olives that I had intended to take when the festival started. I hadn't selected the olives. I'm only going to take them out of the barrel during the festival. So if we hold by the principle of retroactive designation, then we can say, okay, well, these olives that I'm taking now, retroactively, these were the olives that I intended to take before the festival even began. Some of the sages hold by retroactive designation, some of them do not. And we've seen that dispute over and over again. Generally speaking, the halacha, the law, holds that there is retroactive designation, but the sages are going to be very careful of how far you can go in applying that principle. Okay, now we skip over to the A side of page 38. Now, our Mishna that we're discussing says, in the case of one who borrows a vessel from another on the eve of a festival, it is as the feet of the borrower, right? So again, that vessel, let's say it's a bowl, right? Let's say it's a wood bowl, a salad bowl, nice big salad bowl. Now, somebody borrowed it from me. So when did he borrow it? He borrowed it before the festival began, right? He borrows the vessel on the eve of a festival, meaning the afternoon before that festival began, Erev Yom Tov. So he already took possession of this thing that he's borrowing from me. It stands to reason that now that's his salad bowl for the duration of the festival, and therefore that bowl is going to have the same Shabbos boundaries or the same festival boundaries as the borrower. Makes perfect sense. It can go where he can go. All right, it is as the feet of the borrower. Now the Gemara asks, well, it is obvious that this is the case, as the place of rest of the vessel, its festival dwelling, has already been established in the possession of the borrower before the festival began. But the Gemara answers, it is still necessary to state this law in a case where one did not deliver the vessel to him until the festival itself. Before the festival began, John and I agreed that he was going to borrow my salad bowl during the festival, but he wasn't able to get to my house before the festival started to pick it up. I said, no problem, I'll bring it over to your house tomorrow. We're having lunch at your house. I'll just bring the salad bowl with me, right? This is also this community also has a community eruv, so I'm going to be able to carry the bowl during the festival anyway. You could carry for the purposes of food preparation. So now I can carry that bowl over to him. Now you might think, and then he's going to have a third meal, at Peter's house, which is way beyond my festival boundary, but within his festival boundary, right? So I'm going to be able to get the bowl over to him. Let's say, this is Sal, John, and Peter, right? Sal lives here, John lives here, and Peter lives there. Now, if it's my salad bowl and it's in my possession when the festival starts, I should only be able to get that bowl over to here. I could bring it to John's house so we could use it during lunch, but John's not going to be able to take it to Peter's house so they could use it for the third meal at the end of the day. But if we establish that the bowl belongs to John during this festival, then I can bring it to John's house and John can bring it to Peter's house because that bowl has the same boundary as John. That middle circle is John's festival boundary. So even though John didn't pick it up from me before the festival began, if it has his boundary, I can bring it to his house and then he can take it to Peter's house later. That's what we're learning in this law. And the Gemara comments, interpreted in this manner, the Mishnah supports a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. As Rabbi Yochanan said, one who borrows a vessel from another on the eve of a festival, before the festival began, even if he did not give it to him until the festival itself, it is as the feet of the borrower. Right? Since we established that he's gonna borrow it, it's his during the festival, and I can give him possession of it later during the festival, but we established that it's his bowl during the festival by making that agreement that he would borrow it before the festival. It is taught in the Mishna that we're discussing, right? Mishnah number 2 of chapter 5. If one borrowed on the festival itself, it is as the feet of the lender. So now this is a different case. John wants to borrow the bowl, but we didn't agree that he was going to do that before the festival started. We met in synagogue, the night of the festival, and he said, tomorrow when you come to lunch, could you bring that bowl? I said, sure, I'd be happy to lend you the bowl. Now that bowl, which started the festival in my house, and with no intention that I didn't know I was going to be lending it to somebody else. So now that bowl has the same boundary as I do. I can take it to John's house, but he's not going to be able to take it to Peter's house, which is outside of my boundary. And the Gemara again wonders, but this is obvious. The fact that you're lending it to him after the festival started, you didn't have a pre-existing agreement, it's obvious that bowl is going to have the same boundaries as me. Why does that need to be stated? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary to state this law in a case where the borrower is accustomed to borrowing such items from this lender, lest you say that since it is a regular occurrence for this loan to take place, I always bring my bowl to John's house. We don't have to make that agreement before the festival starts. The lender establishes it in his possession ahead of time, and it should therefore be considered as though the object's place of rest is established as the feet of the borrower. The Mishnah therefore teaches us that this is not so. The lender certainly says to himself, well, maybe I'll find someone else this time, and he will go and borrow from him. Right? So even though we do this, we often do this, maybe we even do this seemingly on every festival, but if we didn't agree to do it on this particular festival, I might think to myself, well, he didn't say anything about it. Sue on the other side of my house, she needs a salad bowl too. You know what? John can find somebody else's salad bowl this particular festival. I'm going to lend it to Sue. I'm not going to worry about it. Since I have that option, that bowl, since we don't have this agreement particular to this festival, that bowl retains its boundaries like my feet, not like the habitual borrower's feet, but who didn't agree to borrow it this time. It is taught in the Mishnah. And similarly, a woman who borrowed spices from another to put in a dish, or water and salt to put in her dough, these are as the feet of both of them. All right, now it's getting a little bit more interesting. Right, so now what we have is, okay, I'm gonna bring, before we talk about, I'm gonna just bring my salad bowl over to John's house, and then there's a question, can he take it further than my limits if he wants to then take it up for a third meal over at Peter's house? Okay, now what about two women, and one of them is gonna bake challah during the festival. You can make bread during the festival. But she lacks water and flour, or water and salt. She's got the bread dough, she's got the flour she has flour that she can make bread out of, but she needs fresh water and salt. Okay, so now she says, Mary says to Jane, can you bring me some water and salt? Or can I come to your house and pick up some water and salt? Sure, absolutely you can. But now this challah, which is going to be made from Jane's flour and Mary's water and salt, the resulting bread can only travel on the festival as far as each of them can go, right? So it's going to be that intersecting area, which is within the festival boundaries of both women. That's the teaching from our Mishnah, and now we're going to challenge it. When Rabbi Abba ascended from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael, so from the Jewish community in Bavel, right? It's a Talmud Bavli, so we're talking about the Jewish community in Babylonia, which at this time, the time of the sages, is run by the Persian. It's part of the Persian Empire. And so that was a very well-established Jewish community with tremendous Torah learning. And eventually it's the surviving Torah community, and that's why the Talmud that we're studying is the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud that was compiled in the land of Israel, the sages of Israel, originally those were the sort of more superior, more sophisticated scholars. But they were learning and teaching underneath the oppression of the Roman Empire, and eventually the Romans oppressed them so much that the Jerusalem Talmud was never completed. So while both communities were active, during the time that both were active, the sages of Israel considered themselves to be in possession of a more direct and pure transmission of Torah learning all the way back to Mount Sinai, and the sages in Babylonia were a little bit removed from that. They're not quite the Ivy League scholars like the ones in Israel. But over time, the community in Israel kind of died off, and then eventually, it might not have been as pure a transmission of that knowledge in Babylonia as it was in Israel, but it survived in Babylonia, and they ran out of steam in the land of Israel. But this is during the period when both communities were active. So during this time, the sages that in the Babylonian community, when they come up to Israel, they're a little bit intimidated by the scholars in Israel. So for example, Rabbi Yochanan, right, and all the Tanaim of the Mishnah, the rabbis of the Mishnah, that was all in the Israel community. But after a few hundred years go by, and we're talking about the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud, of the Gemara, they're mostly in Bavel, right, in the Babylonian community. So this is kind of in that in-between time. And Rabbi Abba, who lives and teaches and learns in Babylonia, is going up to Israel. They say going up to Israel or going west to Israel. But usually they talk about going up, ascending, right? They're ascending sort of, it's a little bit higher elevation, but more higher in Torah learning. Okay, so Rabbi Abba is going up to the land of Israel. He's a little bit intimidated, and so he says a little private prayer. He says, "May it be God's will that while I'm up there in Israel, I say a statement of halakha, of Jewish law, that will be accepted by my listeners in the land of Israel, and so that I will not be put to shame. When he ascended, he found Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Hanina bar Papi, and Rabbi Zera, very famous sages. We've encountered them many times. And some say that he found Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, and Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha. And they were sitting and saying in a discussion, they were sitting and learning our Mishna now, the second Mishna of chapter 5 here in Tractate Beitzah. And this part of the Mishnah, that a woman who borrowed spices from another to put into a dish, or borrowed water and salt from her to put in her dough, the resulting dish or the resulting bread is as the feet of both of them. They've both contributed to the dish or to the bread, and now that dish or that bread can only travel to places where both women can travel, the intersection of their Shabbos, of their festival boundaries. So with regard to this Mishnah, Rabbi Abba, he arrives and they were discussing this Mishnah, and they asked the Shaila, the question, why is this halacha, this law, why is this the halacha with regard to the dough? Why is this the law? Now that they both contributed, one contributed the flour, one contributed the water and salt, why should it be as the feet of both of them? Isn't one of them the one who baked it, right? They didn't really bake it together. One of them borrowed water and salt from the other, but then she took the water and salt and she did all the baking and she made the bread. So shouldn't the bread have the same boundary as the woman who baked it? That's the question that they're asking. And Rabbi Abba said to them, so they said, shouldn't the bread have this? Why is this the law? In fact, they're not saying that one of them should have, that the bread should be the same boundary as the one who baked it, but they're just saying, well, that's not the law. And why do we know that? From where do we derive that this is the law? Why is that the law? So Rabbi Abba said to them, and he's going to look at a different area of law to provide some clarity on this question. He says, if one's single kav of wheat became mingled with 10 kav of another's wheat. Okay, so in other words, if the water and salt were nullified in the bread into which it was baked, so then the fact that it came from a different woman shouldn't matter, and now the bread should have the same boundaries as the woman who baked it. But it's not that way, and they're asking why. So now Rabbi Abba is going to give them an answer. He's going to say, well, look at the case of somebody who had a measure of wheat, in this case a kav. How much is a kav? I'm not sure. Just like imagine if it's a measure like 10 sacks of wheat, right, of grain. So let's say that, but it's a measure, right, a kav of wheat. If somebody had a kav of wheat and it became mingled with 10 kav of somebody else's wheat, shall the latter, the one with 10 kav of wheat, shall he eat all 11 kav and rejoice? In other words, I have, let's just call it sack, so it's easier for us to be used to it. I have 1 sack of grain, and my friend over here has 10 sacks of grain. Somehow, the two quantities got mixed up together, right? They were supposed to be kept separate in the storehouse, but they all became mingled. And so now there's 11 kav in one place. Does my friend who has the 10 say, okay, well, this 11 is all mine since they became mixed and, 10 to 1 was mine. So now the one that was added just becomes nullified and becomes part of my original big batch of 10 sacks of grain. And the one who only had 1, you're out of luck. And we don't say that. We don't say that because let's say that my sack of grain was worth $100 and his 10 sacks of grain were worth $1,000. They became all mingled together. They're not going to say that just because the vast majority of what was mingled together is his, that now whatever I added to it, my ownership is nullified, because then I would lose $100. Instead, we say, okay, they became mixed together, but I'm entitled to $100 worth and you're entitled to $1,000 worth, and we're joint owners of what's mingled together, and we're going to separate it out because we're not going to just pretend that mine got nullified and I'm going to be out $100. We don't do that. So Rabbi Abba is suggesting that the woman whose water and salt became incorporated into the bread, Well, that water and salt, especially in an area where drinking water is scarce and not easily transported, that water has value. The salt has value. So we're not going to just nullify it in the bread. She owns something that is part of that bread, and that's why the boundaries of that bread, the bread can only travel to where both of these women can travel with their festival boundaries, not just the one who baked it. That was Rabbi Abba's argument. What did the sages of Israel, the high and mighty sages of Israel, how did they react to his argument of why it should be that it's correct, the law is correct, that the bread has the same boundaries as both women together? The sages laughed at him. He didn't expect to get laughed at. You could see he was nervous. That's why he said a prayer that he should be able to say a teaching in front of the sages of Israel, and that they wouldn't, he wouldn't be put to shame. And the thing that he was most afraid of just happened. They laughed at him. He said to them, "Did I take your cloaks from you that you are putting me to shame?" And they again laughed at him. What does it mean, did I take your cloaks from you? Some say like he was running, like, are you going to treat me like a thief, like some kind of common thief that I'm going to like try to take one of your teachings and twist it and just use it to my own purposes? Some say, did I try to undermine your authority? Like this cloak that I took from you was your mantle of authority and I'm trying to take it from you and you're laughing at me? Like, who does he think he is, that he's going to issue an authoritative ruling in our presence? Bottom line, they laughed at him. Rabbi Oshaya said, they did well to laugh at him. They were correct that the two cases are dissimilar, and they reasoned as follows. Now, let's just stop for a second and say they should not have laughed at him. They might have said, you're wrong, and they might have been correct to say that you're wrong. They might have even said, it is inappropriate. Maybe they were his masters. They were older. They were his elders. And maybe he spoke out of turn. Maybe he's like the recent arrival. He wasn't asked to give it his opinion yet. It wasn't his turn to speak yet. He spoke out of order. None of that is specified. When somebody is trying to do their best and be sincere and offer a good argument, you certainly don't laugh at them. That is totally inappropriate. So let's just say that right now. However, that's what happened. And Rabbi Oshaya said they did well to laugh at him. So maybe there's more facts to this case, and Rabbi Abba was being impertinent in some way. We just don't have the facts on the page yet. And in fact, where it says, did I take your cloaks? Some note that Rabbi Abba's rhetorical question does not seem to fit the situation. Another explanation of these words is that Rabbi Abba was not posing a rhetorical question, but making a statement. He meant that with his answer to their question, he had, as it were, removed their golta, a garment worn by Torah scholars, by means of his simple, straightforward response. Maybe he, in fact, was mocking them a little bit. It was like, well, it's not that complicated. That shouldn't be the law. Or the law makes sense, and this is why. Why are you guys not getting it? And they laughed at him because, like, no, you don't get what's really going on here. And now they're going to explain. What is different about a case of wheat belonging to one person that became mingled with barley of another person that Rabbi Abba did not say this case to them as an example? He brought the example of my wheat, my small amount of wheat, 1 kav of wheat belonging to me became mingled with 10 kav of wheat belonging to this other person. Is that similar to the case of the water and salt that became mingled when it was baked with somebody else's flour? Not really, right? Because each of us is contributing a different item to the mix. So a better example would have been if my wheat became mingled with his barley. Now, can there be nullification when wheat becomes mingled with barley? Rabbi Abba did not say, why did Rabbi Abba not say this is like wheat getting mingled with barley? He specifically chose an example of wheat mingling with other wheat and not the case of barley because that is one type mingled with something that is not its same type. And the principle is a type of food mixed with a large amount of food that is not of its own type does become nullified. And this principle applies even when the two foods belong to two different people. And this is why if you're cooking a beef stew, right, and you drop a little bit of milk into it by accident, now that's milk and meat, and that would render the whole thing prohibited. But if the amount of dairy that drops into the beef stew is less than 1 part in 60, and I'm not sure about meat and milk. I'm pretty sure this applies to meat and milk. There are some things that even if it's 1 in 1,000, it's not going to be nullified. And I believe that's if you can taste it. So if a spice that had actually become tameh, ritually impure, dropped into the beef stew and it was just 1 part in 1,000, but then you could taste that spice and you knew that spice had become ritually impure, and you're going to give this beef stew to a priest whose food has to be ritually pure, then that it would be prohibited. He couldn't eat the stew. But if it's just a regular beef stew and a little bit of dairy drops in, and after it dropped, and it's less than 1 part in 60, and then its flavor disappears, so then it's nullified. And this is this concept of nullification. So what we're wondering about, what these sages were wondering about is, well, what about this water and salt? Do we really taste it in the resulting bread? Maybe it should be nullified because the flour is so much more important a component of the bread than the water and salt is. Rabbi Abba says, just as we wouldn't nullify 1 kav of wheat and 10 kav of wheat, we should nullify the water and salt in the flour of the bread. Now they're saying, that's not the same. It's not 1 kav of wheat and 10 kav of wheat. If you had 1 kav of barley, 1 kav of wheat, let's say, and 60 kav of barley, it certainly would be nullified, even though the wheat got mixed up with the barley. There's so much more barley. Now you can't separate it out. You can't say that you're entitled to, your 1 and I'm entitled to my 60 after the mix happened, because this is not, 61 kav of wheat. Now it's 61 kav of a barley wheat mixture. You can't get what you put into it, and we're just going to nullify the wheat because it's so much more barley. Okay? And the principle is you can nullify one kind of food in another if they are different kinds of food. If they're the same, we don't nullify because you could easily separate them back out. If so, the same may be said when wheat of one individual is mixed with wheat of another as well. Although according to Rabbi Yehuda, an item mingled with another item of the same type is not nullified. According to the rabbis, it is nullified. Right, so what now was saying, well, wait a minute, is the 1 kav of wheat nullified in, let's say, 60 kav of wheat? Some say yes, some say no. Rav Safra said to Rabbi Oshaya. So Rabbi Oshaya said these guys were right to laugh at poor Rabbi Abba. Rav Safra is going to say to Rabbi Oshaya, whoa. And he calls him Moses. So first he says, Moses. And then this is a term of reverence for the leader of a generation. So Rav Safra is going to challenge Rabbi Oshaya, but first he's going to say, Moses, I respect you tremendously, but you might be wrong in this case. Have you in fact spoken well in defending those who scoffed at Rabbi Abba? But did those sages who scoffed not hear of this teaching that Rabbi Chia of Ketosfa said in the name of Rav? One who removes pebbles from another's wheat granary is obligated to reimburse him for the loss that he has caused and pay him for the value of wheat according to the weight of those stones. I had a granary filled with wheat. There were some pebbles mixed in with the wheat. Somebody comes along and plucks out the pebbles, and they're going to make the one who took the pebbles reimburse the owner of the wheat as if the pebbles, the weight of the pebbles, was wheat. Why? It's almost like he did me a favor by removing the pebbles. Why would he have to reimburse me as if the pebbles were wheat? And the reason is, and the latter could have said, the owner of the wheat granary, that those pebbles, along with his wheat, the one who owns the wheat in the granary could have sold the pebbles along with the wheat. Not because he's ripping off his customers, but because everyone knows that when you have a granary full of wheat, there's going to be a few pebbles mixed in. We don't worry about that. We just weigh out what comes, when we scoop out wheat from the granary. So the fact that some of it was pebbles, we wouldn't pick out the pebbles as we sell a large quantity. We would just do it by weight. So the fact that you took pebbles out actually is going to reduce the weight of what I would be selling to my customer, and I could make you reimburse me for removing those pebbles. So apparently, the owner of the granary must compensate the one who removed the pebbles. The one who took the pebbles must compensate the owner of the granary because he has reduced the measure of wheat. Despite the fact that the pebbles themselves are worthless, we do not say that the pebbles were nullified in the wheat and that consequently there is no loss involved in their removal. So according to the principle we learned from this case of the pebbles in the granary, here too, in the case of one who borrows water and salt, right? One woman borrowed water and salt from another woman in order to bake bread during the festival. Here too, in the case of one who borrows water and salt, which are not worthless, the water and salt definitely have value. All the more so may we say that one has reduced his measure and he must compensate the lender. It cannot be said that they are nullified in the dough and that they are no longer taken into account regarding the Shabbos limit. So this is, Rabbi Rav Safra, Rav Safra is challenging Rabbi Oshaya. He's defending Rabbi Abba, who was defending the established law in his discussion with those three sages of the Holy Land when he came up from Babylonian, saying the fact that this woman borrowed water and salt and baked it into her when she made bread, it's correct. The law is correct when it says that the resulting bread is going to have the same Shabbos boundaries as both women, not the same boundaries as the one who baked, because the one whose water and salt were used contributed something that's important to that bread. Abaye objected to the comparison to the case of the pebbles in the wheat granary and said to Rav Safra, and does the master not differentiate between money that has claimants, such as the case of the pebbles removed from the granary in which the owner seeks compensation and therefore there is no nullification, as opposed to money that does not have claimants, as in the case of the water and salt where the owner lent them to the borrower and does not demand them back for now. In the latter case, it is possible for these ingredients to be considered nullified. I mean, the fact that the woman lent her friend some water and salt during the festival, as far as this festival is concerned, she's not expecting to be paid back. She's just happily, in fact, what if she just gave it? The borrowing is maybe part of the issue here too. What if I just give you the water and salt? It wouldn't matter, right? Because the water and salt started in my house when the festival began. But can't we say, I don't expect to get it back. I'm happy to contribute it to the bread. It should just be nullified in the bread because the bread itself is so much more substantial than my water and salt that I contributed to it. And therefore, the bread should have the same boundaries as the woman who baked it. Rav Safra said to Abaye, and according to your reasoning, that one must distinguish between money that has claimants and money that does not, right? The owner of the wheat in the granary is thinking about the value of his granary. The woman who contributed the water and the salt is not thinking about the value of what she contributed. So according to your reasoning that we're going to make this distinction, how would you account for this teaching of Rav Chisda? Because Rav Chisda said, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who maintains that an item can be nullified only when mixed with an item of a different type, but it cannot be nullified in an amount of the same among food of the same kind. What about flesh of an unslaughtered animal carcass being nullified in a larger quantity of meat of a slaughtered animal, right? So an unslaughtered carcass means an animal that was not, even if it's a kosher animal, it was not slaughtered in a kosher manner. So this meat is fit to be fed to dogs or to animals or just to a non-Jew. I mean, non-Jews, they can eat pork, they can eat cow that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner. There's nothing wrong with that. But a Jew can only eat a kosher animal that is slaughtered in a kosher manner. So if you have meat from an animal carcass that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner, and it became mingled with kosher meat that did come from a kosher animal, slaughtered in a kosher manner, could the meat from the carcass be nullified among the kosher meat? Now, you're never going to be able to eat this meat that came from an unkosher slaughtered carcass. But with respect to the ability of that meat to transmit ritual impurity, that's where the question comes up. So now these two kinds of meat were mingled together. A small amount of meat from a carcass, not kosher, among a larger quantity of meat that was kosher. Okay, so what happens? Although carcass meat generally imparts impurity, if a Jew comes into contact with meat of even of a kosher animal but slaughtered in an unkosher manner, it imparts ritual impurity, and if he touched it, he would not be able to enter the temple when the temple is standing, or you could not give it to a priest, and a priest could not, even if you just touched that meat and then you touched a priest, then the priest wouldn't be able to do his duties bringing sacrifices in the temple because he would have contracted tumah, ritual impurity. Although carcass meat generally imparts impurity, if someone touches the mixture of the two meats, he does not become ritually impure, as the carcass meat is considered a different type from the slaughtered animal. Even if it's cow meat in both cases, it's beef in both cases, the beef that came from a cow that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner imparts ritual impurity. The beef that came from a cow that was slaughtered in a kosher manner is ritually pure, unless it became impure for some other reason. If they're mingled together and there's much more of the kosher beef, and then you came into contact, literally touched this mixture, then the carcass meat would be considered nullified within the larger quantity of the kosher meat, and the person who touched it does not become ritually impure. That's the teaching that we're looking at, and we'll see how it applies to our situation. So although the carcass meat generally imparts impurity, if someone touches the mixture of the two meats, he does not become ritually impure, as the carcass meat is considered a different type from the slaughtered animal and is therefore nullified. This is because meat from a slaughtered animal cannot attain the status of carcass, and it is therefore viewed as a different type. And the Gemara continues to cite Rabbi Chisda's statement. However, if meat of a slaughtered animal, kosher slaughtered animal, became mingled with a larger quantity of the pieces of animal carcass, now the meat of the slaughtered animal is not nullified by the carcass, as it is possible for a carcass to attain the status of a slaughtered animal. It's like, what? When I first read that, I had trouble understanding it. But it's not that it could that the meat from the carcass that's not kosher could ever become kosher, but rather that while it is meat from an animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner, it now transmits ritual impurity. But when it totally rots and it becomes inedible even to give to the dogs, now it's not considered meat at all anymore, and at that point, it no longer transmits tumah. And so that's why the meat from the carcass, the unkosher carcass, can attain the status of kosher meat, just in terms of whether it can transmit ritual impurity or not. This means that it can lose its ability to transmit ritual impurity, as if a carcass becomes spoiled to the extent that it is no longer edible, it loses its impure status. And the fact that the carcass meat has the potential ability to attain the status of slaughtered meat renders the two meats as of the same type. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the smaller amount of slaughtered meat would not be nullified in the larger amount of carcass meat. The entirety of the mixture would not be considered carcass meat, but would retain status of intermingled carcass and slaughtered meat. Here too, will you say that if the carcass has owners other than the owner of the slaughtered meat, it is not nullified in the slaughtered meat? And if you say, yes, it is indeed so, but isn't it taught? So now you have the slaughtered meat and the meat from a unkosher carcass, and now they have two different owners and they became mingled. And what does this mean? And if you say, yes, it is indeed so, but isn't it taught? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, ownerless objects acquire the residence for Shabbos in their location, and anyone who finds them on Shabbos may move them 2,000 cubits in all. These objects that we've been talking about, my salad bowl, the lady's bread, they can only go as far as the feet of each of us. That's because they have an owner. What about an ownerless object? If you find something that was lost and doesn't belong to anybody, it's just lying there, how far can that object go? Like I'm walking, I go to synagogue that's 3,000 cubits away or 2,000 cubits away from my house. I can do that. And right near the synagogue, I find on the street, an abandoned salad bowl. Can I pick that up and bring it home? Yes, I can. can't, because the vessel, it doesn't have to be prepared for use, since vessels and utensils are all prepared for use. I could bring that home. Could I bring it to the other end of my Shabbos boundary? No, because it can only go 2,000 cubits from where it started Shabbos, the place where you found it. Ownerless objects acquire residence for Shabbos in the location where they were lying when Shabbos started. And anyone who finds them on Shabbat may only move them 2,000 cubits in all directions from the place where it was found, but not beyond that. As, although they have no owner, it is as though they have an owner. And this shows that even property that has no claimants, we talked about like the wheat in the granary has a value that is claimed by the owner of the granary. But we said that the woman who lends the water and salt to her neighbor to make bread with it, she doesn't care about that value. She's not trying to get the value of that water and salt back. So this shows that even property that has no claimants, like the salt and water in our Mishna, does have its own independent Shabbos limits. The fact that she doesn't care about the value doesn't mean that it loses some kind of inherent value, and it started Shabbos in her house and it can only move 2,000 cubits from that location during the festival in this case. And it does not become nullified when it's mixed into the bread. Abaye said to Rav Safra, are you comparing a halacha, a law involving prohibitions, i.e. ritual law, to monetary law? An object subject to a prohibition, like prohibited food, can be nullified, whereas one's money cannot be nullified. Therefore, the initial question remains, why isn't the small amount of salt and water in the dough, which is subject to the ritual restriction of Shabbos limits, nullified in the rest of the dough in the manner of nullification of all other ritual prohibitions? And what is the reason that the water and salt are not nullified in the dough? Right, so originally Rabbi Abba offered the explanation, well, just like my kav of wheat is not nullified in that my neighbor's 10 kav of wheat, the water and salt shouldn't be nullified. And they laughed at him because it wasn't a good analogy. But the fact remains that the water and salt is not nullified, and we're still looking for that reason. Abaye said, why is it not nullified? It is a decree that the sages made lest a woman make dough in partnership with her neighbors. Indeed, in the case of the Mishnah, the small amount that she received from her neighbor should be nullified in the dough. However, on another occasion, several friends or neighbors might decide to pool ingredients together and prepare bread in partnership. Let's say none of us has enough flour to make as much bread as we need for our neighborhood lunch. So each of us is going to bring the flour that we have. Let's say, 3 people each have a cup of flour. We need 3 cups of flour to make bread together. So each of us brings 3 cups of flour. Now, it makes sense that the bread that's going to result from this is going to have the same boundary as the 3 people all have, the intersection of their boundaries. And we want that to be the result. And so the sages decreed against nullifying the water and salt that are contributed to somebody baking bread on account of we don't want to make this mistake when people are contributing something more substantial like the cups of flour itself. That it was a policy reason rather than a legal philosophical reason. However, on another occasion, several friends or neighbors might decide to pool ingredients and prepare bread in partnership, in which case the bread is certainly bound by the Shabbos limits or the festival limits of all the parties combined. In order to prevent confusion between making dough in partnership and making it with borrowed ingredients like the water and salt, the sages made a decree that the dough in both cases be subject to the same limitations. I am so close to done. If you have any questions, get them in. Rava said a different reason why this is the law. Spices are made in order to add taste to food, and taste is not nullified, like the case of the impure spice that was added to the beef stew. Even though it was 1 in 1,000, the volume of the spice compared to the volume of the beef stew, its taste is still part of the stew. You can taste the spice in that stew, and so it's not nullified, even if the amount of actual substance is minute. Nullification indicates that a small amount of food may be considered insignificant and therefore null and void. But if an ingredient is added with a specific intent that its taste be noticed, there can be no nullification. Should water and salt be nullified in bread? Well, if you made bread with no salt, you would taste the difference, because it should have a little salt, right? Saltless bread might not taste so good. Likewise, water, is water not a significant component of bread? You can't make bread without water. Like, the water really isn't nullified. There would be no bread if you didn't have the water. And the water, it's just a very important component, according to Rava. So, of course, you don't nullify it. And Rav Ashi said a different explanation as to why the spices, water, and salt are not subject to nullification. It is because any one of these ingredients is an object whose prohibition is temporary, as the prohibition against their being taken out of the Shabbos limits lapses once the festival is passed. And the general principle is that anything whose prohibition is temporary cannot become nullified even by 1 part in 1,000. Now, they could have just told us those principles right away, but we traced out this whole argument to, really deepen our understanding of this principle of nullification and how it intersects with the principles of Shabbos boundaries as they are applied on festivals. Okay, let's go to questions and comments. This is not an easy day. If you followed everything that we learned together today, you become a Talmudist. At least to some extent. Okay, page 38. Ifa. With this change of dwelling, does that limit where you can carry food within your original house? Only if, no, you can definitely carry it around your house, because presumably since you changed your dwelling so that you could get to somewhere in that direction. But the house where you slept that night, it has to be within that Shabbos boundary, right? So since your house lies within the boundary, you can carry anything you need to around your house. Now you could ask, what if I really needed to go to the edge, like I put my dwelling, I made the area for my Shabbos boundaries a full 2,000 cubits from my house. And I need to go a full 2,000, because I need to go another 2,000 cubits. I need to go 4,000 cubits in that direction. And I actually stretch that to the utmost of my ability. So it's like where I deposited that basket of food to establish my Shabbos dwelling for this festival is going to be 2,000 cubits from my front door, right? From my front door. So then you might ask, oh, well, once I get past the front door, it's now outside my Shabbos dwelling, right? It's now outside of my Shabbos limit. So could I carry stuff around my house? We actually encountered that question in Tractate Eruvin, I think. I can't even remember the exact answer. My impression is that once you get inside the house, all of the house counts as one unit, even if part of the house sits outside the dwelling. Then you might ask, well, what if your house sits inside the boundaries, but your courtyard doesn't? Does the courtyard go along with the house? I just can't remember the answer to those questions. Sharon, based on the text of Eicha, Lamentations, with references to 6 calves of children's brains, I'm guessing it isn't as large a quantity as a whole sack, more like a vat, I am guessing. What is a kav, right? When I was talking earlier about what is a kav, let's see, kav, Talmudic measure. I looked this up before. A kav, the modern equivalent is about 1.2 liters, right? So you got it. Like a kav of wheat is only like something like this, right? A little bit more than a liter, like a quart of milk. So a little bit more than that. Less than a gallon, more than a quart. So there we go. Okay. And Sharon, I thought the nullification was not acceptable only for Passover. But as we've seen, right, even in that case of 1 in 1,000, if the flavor is still sensed in what gets dropped in, then we're not going to be able to nullify it, right? So it applies to spices, And there's going to be other cases like that. And now you raise a great example that if you drop chametz, right, what we are not allowed to eat during Passover, if you drop that into, a potato stew, I say a potato stew, beef and potato stew, right, because we're not going to, because in Ashkenaz home, we're not going to put beans in there, which is kitnia. I'm sorry, that's a different issue. But if chametz, right, a piece of bread, which is absolutely prohibited in any amount to be within our houses, if that gets dropped into the food, that's going to ruin the whole pot, and a Jew is not going to be able to eat that during Passover. So that's another one of these cases where nullification doesn't work. There are more than, there is more than one. It's not just chametz on Pesach. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. This was a tough day, but it was worth it if you're still with us. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Saturday night, for page 39, and then to make a siyum on Sunday at 6 p.m., the regular time. So tomorrow, it's getting earlier and earlier that we're able to go on Saturday night. I'll aim to try to get on the air by 8 p.m. Pacific or shortly thereafter. May we all be blessed with a beautiful, restful, rejuvenating Shabbos. Good Shabbos.